The Maid Toddler's drawing exposed what the maid never told the Mafia boss. The grand piano in the east wing of the Hargrove estate had not been played in 4 years. It sat beneath the cathedral window where the morning light came in slow and gold, and the dust on its lid had accumulated in the particular way that suggested no one had been asked to clean it, not because they were forbidden, but because something unspoken surrounded that instrument like a border no one dared cross. Dominic Hargrove had bought it for a woman who played Chopin at midnight and left coffee rings on the bench. The woman was gone. The piano remained. These were the two facts that define the East Wing, and the household staff understood both without needing to be told. Nadia Voss had worked in the Hargrove estate for 2 years and 3 months. She knew the borders. She knew which rooms required permission to enter, which hallways fell silent when Dominic passed through, and which silences were the dangerous kind versus the habitual kind. She was 29. With dark hair, she kept pulled back and hands that moved through domestic labor with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned early that visibility was a liability. She arrived before 6 in the morning and she left well after dark, and in between she was present without being noticed, which was precisely the arrangement she needed. What she had not anticipated, on a Tuesday morning in the first week of October, was that her son would wander into the East Wing while she was stripping linens from the guest rooms on the floor above. Matteo was 3 years old. He did not speak much, and when he did it was in short, declarative sentences that somehow always contain more information than a 3-year-old ought to have. He watched things. People mostly. He would sit in the corner of whatever room Nadia was working in and observe the household staff move through their routines with the focused attention of someone cataloging details. The staff had grown fond of him in the careful, collective way that people become fond of things they've decided it is safe to love. They called him the quiet one and left small treats on low shelves for him to find, and they did not ask Nadia questions about his father. Matteo had his mother's dark hair and his mother's capacity for stillness, but he had someone else's eyes.
Gray.
Not common gray, but the specific gray of lake water in November, cold and deep and backlit by something that was not warmth exactly, but was something close to it. Nadia knew whose eyes they were. She had spent 2 years and 3 months arranging her life around that knowledge without ever letting it surface. On that Tuesday morning, while Nadia was on the floor above and Matteo was theoretically in the care of Lourdes, the estate's cook, who had turned her back to check a pot, Matteo had walked down the east hallway with his box of crayons and found the piano. He did not touch the keys. He settled onto the floor beneath the bench, in the small cave of shadow the instrument made, and he drew. He used the back of a grocery receipt he'd found in his mother's coat pocket. He was a resourceful child, and he drew with the focused concentration that was his signature expression. When he was done, he left the drawing on the floor and wandered back toward the kitchen, where Lourdes found him standing patiently beside the refrigerator as if he had never moved. The drawing stayed where it was. Dominic Hargrove found it at 7:45 that evening. He came into the East Wing the way he always did when the pressure of running an empire that existed in the margins of legitimate business became something he needed to set down briefly. Not resolved, just set down. He stood in front of the piano. He did not lift the lid. He almost never did. But this time something on the floor caught his attention. A small rectangle of paper, white side up, decorated in crayon. He picked it up the way a man picks up something he expects to be inconsequential. 3 stick figures. 2 small, 1 tall. All holding hands. A sun in the corner, colored crimson red rather than yellow, which struck him as unusual. A house behind them with 2 windows both lit. And on the tallest figure's wrist, small, careful, deliberate, a black spiral that curved back on itself in the unmistakable shape of a serpent eating its own tail. Dominic Hargrove stood very still. The serpent tattoo on his left wrist was not public knowledge. It was not something visible in photographs or mentioned in the profiles his enemies compiled on him. It was old ink, done when he was 19 by a man who is dead now, in a city he rarely visited. His inner circle had seen it. Exactly two other people outside that circle had ever traced it with their fingers. One of them was buried in a cemetery in Massachusetts. The other, according to every reliable source he had, was also dead. He turned the drawing over. The grocery receipt. He recognized the handwriting on the front, a list in Nadia's precise, small print. Milk. Rice. Crayons. He stood in the East Wing for a long time after that, the drawing held between two fingers, the silence of the piano behind him, the crimson sun facing upward in the October light. He did not call anyone. He did not summon Nadia. He folded the drawing once, carefully, and put it in the inner pocket of his jacket, against his chest, where he kept things he was not ready to examine but could not afford to discard. By the time he walked back into the main wing of the estate, his expression had returned to its default setting, composed, deliberate, the face of a man who processes information the way a glacier processes pressure, slowly, invisibly, and with eventual catastrophic force. But something had shifted. A fault line, long dormant, had registered its first tremor. Lured, who was leaving the kitchen as he passed, noticed that he paused in the doorway between the hallway and the dining room and looked toward the staff quarters at the back of the house. Just a look. A second, maybe two. Then he moved on. She mentioned it to no one. But she noted it because Lured had worked in the Hargrove estate for 11 years, and in 11 years, she had learned that the things Dominic Hargrove looked at twice were the things that eventually changed everything. The estate operated on a kind of controlled ecosystem. There were the outer layers, the security personnel, the drivers, the rotating cast of men in dark jackets who occupied the grounds and the gatehouse, and the 3 SUVs that were always idling at the edge of the driveway as if the property itself were prepared to flee. Then there were the inner layers, the business associates who arrived on Wednesday evenings and departed before midnight, the lawyers who came with leather portfolios and stayed for coffee, the underboss, Marcus Webb, who occupied the second-floor office twice a week and moved through the estate with the particular ease of a man who understood the value of making himself at home in someone else's house. And then there was the domestic interior, Lured and her kitchen, the 2 groundskeepers, the housekeeper Elena, who was 60 and had been with the family since Dominic's mother's time, and Nadia. Nadia occupied a position within this ecosystem that was unique not because of her role, but because of what she had built around it. She was, on paper, a housekeeper. In practice, she was the person who understood how the estate ran, who fixed what Elena could no longer manage, who knew which deliveries came on which mornings and how to arrange the household so that Dominic's professional life and his domestic life maintained the separation he required. She was good at her job in the way that people are good at things when their survival depends on the quality of their performance. She was also, beneath all of that, running a careful and exhausting long game. She had taken the job knowing what it was. She had researched the estate, the staff structure, the position opening, the background check requirements. She had spent 3 months preparing her documentation before she applied. The name Voss was her maternal grandmother's name. Her social security number was legitimate, attached to a life she had carefully constructed over the 4 years before she arrived here. Everything about her employment record was real. The lie was only in the omission, in what she had chosen not to put on the application, the one biographical detail that would have changed everything. She was not here by accident. She was not here by desperation, though desperation had been the original fuel. She was here because this was the only place in the world where she and Matteo were, in a complex and terrible way, safe. The danger that surrounded Dominic Hargrove also protected the people inside his orbit, provided those people were invisible enough not to become leverage. She had calculated this. She had weighed it against every alternative, and this was what remained. What she had not calculated, with sufficient precision, was Matteo. Matteo had his own logic. He was 3, but he operated with an emotional instinct that bypassed the protocols Nadia had put in place. He did not understand why they could not eat dinner with Lured in the main kitchen when Dominic was home. He did not understand why he must never wander into the front rooms. He accepted these rules in the way young children accept gravity, as conditions of the world rather than restrictions, but he also had a child's capacity to forget, in a moment of interest, that the rules applied to him. The drawing was not the first incident. It was the most significant, but it was not the first. 3 weeks earlier, Matteo had been sitting in the corner of the staff hallway with a board book when Dominic had come through the back entrance unexpectedly. A security concern had rerouted him through the kitchen side. He had rounded the corner and nearly stepped on the child. He had stopped. Matteo had looked up. Their eyes had met, and Nadia, who had come out of the supply closet at the sound of footsteps, had arrived to find her son looking at Dominic Hargrove with an expression she could only describe as recognition. Not familiarity. The child saw Dominic regularly in the peripheral way that household staff children absorb the rhythms of an estate. Recognition. As if something internal had fired in response to something it had been, on some cellular level, waiting for. Dominic had looked at the child for a moment, then at Nadia, then back at the child. He had said nothing. He had stepped around Matteo with the careful precision of a large man avoiding something fragile, and continued down the hallway. Nadia had crouched down and held Matteo's face in her hands and told him quietly, in the measured tone that was her version of panic, to stay where he was told. Matteo had nodded. He had touched her cheek with his small hand and said, with absolute calm, "He has sad eyes." She had taken a breath so controlled it was almost not a breath. She had agreed, quietly, that yes he did, and then she had taken him back to their room at the end of the staff wing and sat on the edge of the bed for a few minutes while she rebalanced. The drawing changed the calculus. She knew at the moment. She went to the east wing to clean the following morning and found the floor beneath the piano bare. She knew what Matteo had drawn. She'd seen him working on it, though she hadn't understood its destination. She knew what detail he had included because Matteo was a child who drew what he saw, and what he had seen was a photograph. A single photograph that Nadia kept in the bottom of her toiletry bag, behind a false panel she'd made from the cardboard backing of a notepad, of a man with his arm around a woman, and a spiral tattoo on his wrist. She had been almost certain Matteo couldn't see the tattoo in the photograph. It was small, and the photograph was not large. She had underestimated him. She stood in the east wing looking at the bare floor and did the mathematics of exposure. The drawing was gone. Dominic had been in the east wing last evening. Elena had mentioned it in passing, as Elena occasionally mentioned things, believing she was sharing neutral information. He had the drawing. He was too intelligent not to have noticed the tattoo. He was too controlled to have already acted on it, which meant he was still processing. She had, at most, a few days before he came to her with questions she had spent years preparing to answer, and now, standing in the east wing with her heart at a controlled but elevated rate, found she was not prepared to answer at all. She straightened. She picked up her cleaning supplies. She made the window casings spotless. This was what she did with the things she couldn't control yet. She cleaned around them. Marcus Webb had worked alongside Dominic Hargrove for 14 years, and in those 14 years he had become an expert in one specific skill, reading the temperature of a room Dominic was in without appearing to read anything at all. It was the skill that had kept him alive and relevant and positioned within the most trusted inner circle of an organization that had survived 3 federal investigations and 2 succession attempts. Marcus was not the smartest man Dominic trusted, but he was the most perceptive, and he had learned to weaponize that perception with the quiet patience of someone who understood that timing was the only currency that really mattered. He noticed the change on Wednesday. The Wednesday evening meetings were a ritual. 4 men around the dining room table, papers spread, the kind of conversation that would have interested federal prosecutors very much, and therefore was conducted under protocols that made recording effectively impossible. Marcus sat across from Dominic, as always. To Dominic's left, Raymond Cho, who handled the financial architecture. To Marcus's right, Daniel Priest, who was young and ambitious and had been allowed into this circle recently because Dominic believed in controlled proximity to ambition. Better to have it where you could see it. Dominic was present. He spoke when required. He approved 2 financial transfers and declined a proposal from a distribution partner in Ohio with a flat, unreasoned certainty he usually reserved for things he'd already decided before entering the room. Nothing unusual in the content of the meeting. The temperature, however, was different. Marcus had a system. He tracked the number of times Dominic's eyes moved to the window on his left. It was a focus displacement, something Dominic did when his attention was divided between the present conversation and something else he was processing. On a typical Wednesday, it happened perhaps 3 times. On this Wednesday, Marcus counted 11. He said nothing during the meeting. He accepted a glass of water from Nadia, who came in silently at one point to refresh the glasses, and he watched Dominic in his peripheral vision while Nadia was in the room. Dominic did not look at Nadia. This was itself information. Dominic typically acknowledged the staff with a brief, impersonal nod. He was a man who believed small courtesies cost nothing. He did not nod at Nadia. He looked at his papers. After the meeting, when Raymond and Daniel had gone and Marcus was pulling on his coat in the front hallway, he heard something that confirmed the shift in temperature. The child, the maid's quiet boy, was in the staff hallway, visible through the half-open door to the kitchen corridor, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a small wooden puzzle. Dominic had come through from the dining room to see the men out and had paused at the door to the corridor for a fraction of a second before continuing to the front entrance. It was the pause that mattered. Not long enough to be noticed by anyone who wasn't already watching. Long enough to confirm that Dominic Hargrove was thinking about something in that direction. Marcus drove home along the lake road and thought carefully about what he had observed, arranging it against what he already knew. He knew that Nadia Voss had been vetted. He had run the check himself, 2 years ago. Clean record, legitimate employment history, no visible connections to any of Dominic's rivals or federal contacts. He had approved the hire. He knew she had a son, and that the boy lived on the premises because the nearest family was 3 states away and the childcare economics of a live-in position made the arrangement practical. He had categorized both as non-factors. He was revising that categorization now. The specific thing that Marcus Webb was afraid of, the thing he had been managing around for the past 8 months with the careful efficiency of a man defusing a device he built himself, was the stability of his own position. Dominic was 42. He had no acknowledged children, no heir, no succession structure that guaranteed continuity through bloodline. The organization ran on Dominic's authority, which was total and unchallengeable now, but the question of what came after had begun to circulate in certain conversations that Marcus both participated in and quietly encouraged. He was 51. If a transition was coming, the window for his own ascent was not infinite. A child changed everything about that equation. He didn't know yet what the child was. He had a hypothesis, and it was a serious one, and it was the kind of hypothesis that required either confirmation or elimination before it became a threat to plans that had been years in construction. He did not act immediately. Marcus Webb was not a man who acted immediately. He made a phone call on Thursday morning to a woman who worked for a genealogy service that did, on occasion, work of a more sensitive nature. He gave her Nadia Voss's name and asked for depth, not the surface record he already had, but the layer beneath it. The real name, if there was one. The real history. He told her he needed it within the week. He told her to be discreet in the way you tell someone to be discreet when what you mean is that discovery of this inquiry would be professionally fatal. Then he went back to the business of Wednesday's unresolved Ohio question and waited with the practiced calm of a man who had learned that the most dangerous thing you could do in his world was appear to want something too much. He was careful. He was patient. He had been both of these things for 14 years. He had also, in 14 years, been wrong about Dominic Hargrove exactly twice. Both times, the correction had cost someone else their position or their safety. He was fairly certain that a third correction was not something he would survive in the same career, and so he was especially careful now, especially patient, and especially attentive to the fact that the thing he was moving against was a man whose greatest documented ability was seeing betrayal before it fully formed. He had a week, maybe less, to know what the child was. After that, the shape of the problem would determine the shape of the solution. On Thursday evening, Dominic Hargrove did something he had not done in 2 years. He opened the bottom drawer of the desk in his private office, the one with a mechanical lock that only he keyed, and removed a manila envelope he had not opened since the night he received it. He placed it on the desk. He looked at it for approximately 1 minute without touching it. Then he opened it. The envelope contained a report from the investigator he had hired in the weeks after the accident. A police report addendum. 2 photographs of a vehicle, post-collision, taken at a distance that suggested the photographer understood the sensitivity of the commission. And a death certificate for a woman named Claire Renard, issued by the state of Massachusetts, dated 4 years and 2 months ago. Her real last name had not been Renard. She had not been using it when she died. She had not been using it for the 4 months before she died, because during those 4 months, something had happened between her and Dominic that fell outside the categories of their professional and personal arrangement and into something neither of them had been equipped, at the time, to name. She had used a name she'd borrowed from her grandmother. She had done this, as far as Dominic had understood, because someone in his world had identified her as a vulnerability, and she was protecting herself. She had been protecting herself. He had believed that. He had also believed, in the dark, honest hours, that she had been protecting him, that the separation had been an act of love from a woman who understood his world well enough to know that loving him from a distance was safer for both of them than loving him from inside it. He had been angry about this for a long time. The anger had converted, eventually, into grief. The grief had settled into the kind of low-grade permanent ache that a man in his position could not afford to give a name to, and so he hadn't. He looked at the death certificate now. Claire Renard. Date of birth. Date of death. County. The certificate was clean and official and completely legitimate, which was what made it wrong. He had thought, in the first weeks after receiving it, that the wrongness was grief distorting his reading of bureaucratic documents. He had attributed his resistance to the reality of her death to the common human refusal to accept loss. He had eventually, through the disciplined application of reason, accepted the certificate as genuine and moved forward. He was looking at it now through a different lens. He picked up the drawing from his jacket pocket. He had not put it down, not really, not in 2 days, and placed it beside the death certificate. The serpent on the tall figure's wrist. Mateo's gray eyes, which he had seen from 3 feet away in a hallway, and which had stopped something in his chest with the specificity of a key in a lock. The maid's handwriting on the grocery receipt. He had looked at it again, and it had a quality he recognized without being able to source. He was a man who made his living on pattern recognition. He read people the way other men read financial statements, for inconsistency, for the place where the number didn't match the structure around it. He had survived by trusting this faculty absolutely. Everything he was looking at pointed in one direction. The question was not whether Nadia Voss was who he was beginning to believe she was. His body had already answered that question, in the way the body answers questions before the mind catches up, with a physiological response that was not quite grief, and not quite recognition, but was something that lived in the overlap between them. The question was why. If she was alive, and he was operating now on the premise that she was, that the death certificate was a document she had obtained rather than received, that the accident had been staged or survived in a way his investigator had not uncovered, then the 4 years of silence had been a choice. The 4 years of letting him believe she was dead had been a choice. The 2 years of working in his house under a constructed name, sleeping 30 meters from where he slept, raising a child he had not known existed, had been a choice. That was the thing that didn't reduce neatly. He could construct the architecture of why she had faked her death. He had enemies who had identified her. The threat had been real. She had been operating on incomplete information about whether she could trust him to protect her. He could build that case logically, and it held. But the 2 years inside his house, that required a different explanation. That was not the behavior of a woman hiding from him. That was the behavior of a woman orbiting something she had decided she could not leave entirely. He sat with this for a long time in the private office. Then he thought about the child. Mateo, 3 years old, which put his conception approximately 4 months before the accident, in the window when everything between them had been alive and unnamed and real. Gray eyes. Specific gray. The drawing. He had a son. The recognition of this landed in him not as shock. He had been walking toward it for 2 days, but as a kind of seismic settling, the way a building shifts after an earthquake and finds its new structural reality. He was a father. The woman he had mourned for 4 years was alive and working in his house, and had been raising his child within the walls of an estate that was simultaneously the most protected and the most dangerous address in the state. He understood the logic of it, suddenly and completely. She had not been hiding from him. She had been hiding near him. She had put herself and their child inside the perimeter of his protection without telling him, because telling him would have required trusting that he would receive the information correctly, and she had not known. She still did not know whether he would. The anger came then. Not the cold professional anger he used as a tool, but something older and more personal, with grief inside it, and something that was almost admiration, which was what made it so complicated.
He folded the drawing.
He put it back against his chest. He needed to think before he moved. Because the next move mattered enormously, not just for what it would mean between him and the woman in the staff wing who was not Nadia Voss, but because if Marcus or anyone else in his circle had begun to notice what he'd noticed, the window between information and danger had already started to close. Nadia knew he was coming before he knocked. She had spent Thursday operating at a frequency of controlled alertness that manifested externally as perfect professional normalcy. She had cleaned the West Wing. She had organized the pantry. She had done Mateo's laundry and read to him from a picture book about trains and put him down at 7:30 and then sat in the small chair by the window in their room and waited, because the body knows things the mind hasn't finished calculating, and her body had been telling her since Wednesday morning that the arrival of consequences was imminent. The knock came at 9:47. Quiet. Not aggressive. The knock of someone who expected to be admitted without theater. She opened the door. Dominic filled the doorframe in the way large men with large gravity do, not through physical size alone, but through the quality of the space they alter simply by occupying it. He was in a dark shirt, no jacket, which meant this was not an official audience. He held the drawing in his left hand. She looked at the drawing. She looked at him. She stepped back from the door. He entered. He looked at the room, small, neat, deliberately sparse, a child's shoes by the door, a board book on the nightstand, Mateo asleep in the narrow bed against the wall. He looked at the sleeping child for a moment that lasted long enough to have weather in it. Then he looked at Nadia. He put the drawing on the table between them. "The tattoo," he said, quietly, in deference to the sleeping child. Not a question.
"Yes," she said. His jaw moved.
"How old is he?" 3 years and 2 months. He did the arithmetic. She watched him do it. She watched the result land. Claire. Her real name, in his voice, after 4 years of no one saying it. It moved through her like a current. "I go by Nadia now," she said, and even she heard how inadequate that was. "You go by Nadia," he repeated flat. "In my house. For 2 years. Yes." Voila, he stopped. He was pressing something down, and she could see the effort of it in the line of his shoulders. "I attended a memorial. For you. I stood at an empty grave and He stopped again. She didn't fill the silence. She had prepared speeches for this moment, and every version of them felt like an insult now, standing in the actual room with his actual face doing the things it was doing. "There were men," she said finally, because the beginning was the only true beginning. "After I found out I was pregnant, 2 of them came to my apartment. They knew about us. They told me that if I stayed visible, if I stayed connected to you in any traceable way, they would use me to get to you, and then they would remove me." Those were the words. Remove me. Who? I didn't know then. I know now. It was coordinated from inside your organization.
She paused.
I suspected it was Marcus. I still do. I couldn't prove it, and I couldn't tell you without proof because I didn't know if the information would reach him before it reached you. Something moved across his face. You should have come to me. I was 25 and 2 months pregnant, and I had just been told that my proximity to you was a death sentence. She said this without heat, as a statement of conditions rather than an accusation. I made the best decision I could make with what I had. I gave you a body, and I gave myself a way to stay close enough that if things changed. If things changed, he said, and now the heat was in his voice, low and contained but real. I grieved you. I want you to understand what that means. I don't grieve things. I've spent 4 years operating on the understanding that you were. He pressed his hands flat on the table. Do you know what I am? Do you know what kind of man I am and what kind of world I run, and what it means that I let something reach me the way you reached me, and then… Yes, she said.
Soft.
Not submission, acknowledgement. I know exactly what you are. That is why I came back. The room was very quiet. Mateo made a small sound in his sleep, and both of them looked at him reflexively, with the identical involuntary attention of people whose nervous systems had been calibrated to the same small life. The simultaneity of it was not lost on either of them. Dominic looked at Mateo for a long time. The boy was on his back, one arm flung out, his face slack with the total, trusting abandon of a sleeping child. Even in dim light, the eyes, behind their closed lids, defined the face. The architecture was unmistakable to a man looking for it. He drew the tattoo from a photograph, Dominic said.
Yes.
I kept one. I should have. Don't tell me you should have destroyed it. He was still looking at Mateo. He drew me into the picture. He drew us holding hands. He doesn't know who you are. She stopped. He watches you. He's watched you from the beginning. I think children recognize things they don't have language for. Dominic stood up straight. He put his hands in his pockets. She knew from 4 years ago what he did when he needed to contain something that didn't have a protocol. Marcus has been watching you, he said. I noticed it this week. He's noticed something is different. I don't know how much he's moved on it. The temperature in the room changed. This was what she had feared in addition to everything else. Not that Dominic would find out, but that someone else would find out first. What do we do? She asked. He looked at her. For years of absence and grief and anger and the complicated residue of something that had never been resolved properly folded into the look, and then were set aside because this was the thing about a man like Dominic Hargrove. He could feel everything and still treat it. You let me think, he said. You do nothing different. You change nothing. And you do not let him out of your sight. He picked up the drawing from the table. He held it briefly, carefully, and then he put it down again, left it with her. Lock the door, he said, and left. She locked the door. She stood with her back against it and let out a breath that had been building for 2 years and 3 months, and then she went and sat on the edge of Mateo's bed and put her hand on his chest and felt him breathe, and did not sleep. The genealogy researcher got back to Marcus in 4 days, not 7, because she was good at her work and because what she found was accessible to someone who knew where to look. The name Claire Renard was a constructed identity, attached to documentation that was genuine but shallow in the way constructed identities are when you look at them from the right angle. Beneath it, Claire Maddox, 29 years old. Last legitimate address in Providence, Rhode Island, before a gap, before a resumption under the Voss surname. A birth record for a male child, Mateo Voss, father not listed. Marcus sat with this information on Monday morning in his car outside the estate and understood what he was looking at with the full clarity of a man whose fears have been confirmed so precisely they feel almost like relief. He called a number he kept in a separate phone, one that he used rarely and always with the awareness that the call itself was a declaration. The man on the other end was named Gerald Ford, not the president, a standing joke he never found funny, and he represented the Ohio Distribution Group, whose proposal Dominic had declined on Wednesday. The Ohio Group was one of 3 organizations that had been circling Hargrove territory for the better part of 2 years, looking for leverage, looking for the specific kind of soft point that powerful men develop when they allow themselves human attachments. Marcus told Gerald Ford that he had information the group would find valuable. He told him the broad shape of it: a child, an heir, an unacknowledged vulnerability, and he quoted a number for its delivery that was specific enough to confirm he was serious. This was the moment. He knew it as the moment he crossed from managing his position to actively subverting it, and he crossed it with the cold intentionality of a man who had calculated that the alternative, remaining in a world where Dominic Hargrove now had a son and an heir and a reason to reorganize succession structures that currently benefited Marcus, was worse. He had spent 14 years. He was not going to spend another 14 at diminishing relevance. What Marcus Webb did not know, the specific variable that his excellent perceptiveness had failed to account for, was that Dominic had anticipated him. Not the precise mechanism, not the phone call or the Ohio connection, but the general shape of Marcus's calculation, because Dominic Hargrove had spent 14 years watching the same man he now suspected, and loyalty has a texture, and that texture changes when ambition starts to apply pressure. He had felt the change in the Wednesday meeting. He had confirmed it, silently, through 2 days of careful observation and one conversation with Raymond Cho, who had mentioned, with the careful neutrality of someone leaving information without appearing to leave information, that Marcus had been making calls from a secondary phone on the property. Raymond Cho was not a good man. He was, however, a man whose specific self-interest aligned with Dominic's continued authority and who understood that the organization's stability was the floor beneath his own prosperity. He had come to Dominic on Sunday morning and said, with the economy of language that characterized his best communications, "You should know that Marcus has been using this secondary line. Twice that I've seen." Dominic had thanked him. He had given no indication of what he was going to do with the information. He had called a meeting for Tuesday morning. When Marcus arrived on Tuesday, he found Dominic at the dining room table with Raymond and Daniel Priest and 2 men he hadn't seen before, calm men, unremarkable in appearance, the kind of unremarkable that was itself a professional signal. He found, also, that the seat at the table that was typically his was occupied by a specific silence, a conspicuous absence of invitation to sit down. Dominic looked at him from across the table without expression for a moment. That was its own complete sentence. "Gerald Ford," Dominic said. Marcus did not move. "Ohio," Dominic said. "My son." He said "my son" with the flat, declarative weight of a man using a phrase for the first time and feeling the full gravity of it. "You called them about my son before I had a chance to finish deciding what to do about knowing I had one." The room was very still.
14 years, Marcus said. His voice was steady.
He was, regardless of everything else, a professional. "And you would have reorganized everything. You know you would have. I've seen what an heir does to these structures." "You don't get to calculate what I would have done," Dominic said. "That's the distinction. You manage your area. You don't manage my blood." It was already going to change. You called men who would have used a 3-year-old as leverage. The temperature in the room dropped several degrees. "Against me. A child. To Ohio." He let that sit. "You've known me for 14 years, and you thought I'd leave you standing after that." Marcus, to his credit or his professional conditioning, did not perform remorse. "I thought you'd leave me standing even less if you had continuity." "That's probably the most honest thing you've ever said to me," Dominic replied, and there was something almost sad in it, the way men can be sad about the confirmation of suspicions they'd been carrying for years. Which is also an indictment. The 2 unremarkable men had moved slightly. Marcus noted it with the peripheral awareness of someone who understood what it meant. "You're going to give me Gerald Ford," Dominic said. "Everything. Then we're going to have a much longer conversation." This was the moment, and the audience watching this story unfold, tracking Marcus as the secondary antagonist they'd understood as competent and dangerous, understood suddenly that his villainy had always had a structural logic to it, that he was not a monster, but a man who had watched a door he'd been promised stay closed for too long, and had finally forced it. This did not make him sympathetic. But it made him human, which was somehow more disturbing. The most dangerous people in closed systems are not the psychopaths. They are the pragmatists who run out of patience. And in the understanding of this, the moral landscape of the story shifted slightly. Nadia's 4 years of silence suddenly looked less like deception and more like prophecy. She had known, without knowing the specific man or mechanism, that Dominic had something near him that was sharpening a knife. She had come back anyway. She had put herself and Matteo into the radius of maximum danger because she'd calculated it was the only radius that also contained the possibility of maximum safety. She had been right. She had also been living with the knowledge that she might not be. 3 days after the Tuesday meeting, Dominic Hargrove came to find Nadia in the East Wing. She was cleaning the baseboards, real work, the kind that required being on your knees, and she heard him before she saw him, the particular cadence of his footsteps that she had catalogued over 2 years the way you catalog sounds that carry information. She sat back on her heels and waited. He came and stood in the doorway of the East Wing, the light from the cathedral window behind him making the room look the way it only looked in the late morning. He looked at the piano, briefly, and then at her. "Marcus is handled," he said. "The Ohio situation is handled. It'll take a week to be fully contained, but the threat to you and Matteo is neutralized." She nodded. She had been waiting for this information the way she had been waiting for most things over the past 4 years, with the stillness of someone who has learned that receiving news, good or bad, in visible pieces is a luxury you can't always afford.
"Thank you," she said.
He moved into the room. He stood near the piano. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she remembered, the one he made when he was holding something he didn't have a protocol for and was deciding whether to construct one or simply carry it differently. "I need to understand something," he said. "Not for the practical issues. Those are being resolved. For me." He paused. "You were inside this house for 2 years. You made Matteo's lunches in that kitchen. You cleaned this room. You were 30 meters from where I sleep. And in 2 years, there was not one moment, not one, where you considered that I deserved to know." She stood up from the floor and set down her cloth and looked at him directly. This was the conversation she had rehearsed for 4 years, and now that it was here, she found that the rehearsed versions were all wrong, too defensive, too explanatory, too organized for what the moment actually needed, which was just the truth, bare and imperfect. "Every day," she said. "Every single day I considered it. Every day I watched you come through a door or walk down a hallway, and I calculated whether this was the day to tell you, and every day I came back to the same calculation." She paused. "I didn't doubt that you'd protect us if you knew. I doubted that you'd protect yourself. I was afraid that knowing you had a son would become a weapon against you before you had time to manage it, and that weapon would come from inside your own circle, which I couldn't identify specifically enough to defend against." He was watching her. His expression had the quality of a man who is listening not just with his ears but with the whole architecture of his history with a person. "I was right about that," she said quietly. "Marcus. I was right." "You were right," he agreed. The acknowledgement was not generous, exactly, but it was real. "You were also right in a way that cost us 4 years. That's not a clean balance." "No," she said. "It's not." This was the thing about having a child with someone, even a child they had not raised together. The vocabulary of grievance and justification eventually runs into the fact of a small person who exists because of both of them and belongs to both of them, and is currently, as they were having this conversation in the kitchen with Lord learning how to roll pasta dough with the serious concentration he applied to everything, unaware that the adults responsible for his entire world were 30 meters away trying to find a language for 4 years of impossible choices. "I looked for you," Dominic said, and this was the part she had not expected, not the fact of it, which she had suspected, but the way it came out, quiet and unguarded, the voice of a man who had spent 4 years keeping something undercover and was now, for the first time, not doing that. After the accident, I had 3 people on it for 6 months. They all came back to the same certificate. He stopped. I buried something I couldn't bury. And then I built a structure around the space where it had been. And I have been running an organization and a life out of that structure for 4 years. I know, she said. I'm sorry. I'm not looking for an apology. He said it without sharpness. I'm telling you that the man who is standing here now is built partly on an absence that you put there. That's relevant. Not as accusation. As information you should have. She received this the way it was given, as information. As the beginning of an honest accounting between 2 people who had been, for different reasons and through different choices, dishonest with each other for a long time. What do you want to do? She asked. He looked at the piano. He was quiet for a moment. Then he walked to it and lifted the lid and looked at the keys, which no one had touched in 4 years. He did not play anything. He just looked at them. I want to know my son, he said. I want to do that the right way, which means not terrifying him. I want it done slowly. He turned from the piano. And I want Claire Maddox to exist again, with documentation I provide, under protections I build. No more constructed names. No more borrowed identities. She breathed. And us. That's a longer conversation, he said. That's a conversation for when Mateo knows who I am and when you're here because you've chosen to be here, not because it's the safest perimeter. I don't want you inside this house, because the walls are high. I want to know what you want when you're standing outside them. He paused. Can you tell the difference right now? She thought about it honestly, because he deserved honesty, because she owed him at minimum the respect of not substituting relief for clarity. Not entirely, she said. Not yet. Then we take the time, he said. That evening, Dominic sat in the kitchen with Mateo while Lourdes made dinner. He sat at the table, and Mateo brought him a crayon drawing he had just finished, a sun, this one yellow, and a large figure, and a small figure standing beside what appeared to be a dog, though they did not have a dog. He placed it on the table in front of Dominic with the solemn gift-giving energy of a child who has decided you are worth giving something to. Dominic looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then he looked at Mateo. Who's the dog? He asked. That's not a dog, Mateo said, with 3-year-old certainty. That's a lion. Dominic looked at the drawing again. He did not argue the point. He nodded slowly, with the expression of a man receiving information he finds unexpectedly correct. Good, he said. Every house needs one. Mateo regarded him with those lake gray eyes and then sat down at the table across from him and opened his crayon box and began a new drawing, and the 2 of them were quiet together in the kitchen while Lourdes moved around the stove and the October light came through the window, and the estate, which had been running on a structure built around absence, began, slowly and without ceremony, to reorganize itself around something that was present. There was nothing clean about what had brought them here. The 4 years would not reduce to a lesson or a vindication. Nadia had been right about the danger and wrong to carry the truth alone for as long as she had, and both of those things were permanently true. Dominic had built a life on a grief that was manufactured and also real, because the absence had been real even if its cause had not been death. Mateo had grown his first 3 years inside a contradiction, protected by the proximity of a man who didn't know him, watched over by a mother who loved him with a fierce, exhausted devotion of someone doing 2 jobs at once, one visible and one invisible, both necessary. The drawing was still on the table in Nadia's room. The one with the serpent on the tall figure's wrist and the crimson sun. She had not moved it. In a world where weakness invites execution, the most dangerous thing a man like Dominic Hargrove could do was acknowledge a love that could be used against him. He had spent 4 years avoiding that danger by believing the love was gone. It had taken a crayon drawing by a child who drew what he saw, without strategy and without fear, to prove that the most dangerous thing was not the love itself. It was the distance he had put around it in the name of safety. The thing that had nearly destroyed them was not the truth. It was the architecture they had built to survive the truth. And now the architecture was coming down wall by wall, In a kitchen in October, one crayon drawing at a time.